Welcome to Wednesday's edition of Renew Plus. I'm Pastor Tony. Thank you for joining us here midweek of week number 14 of our series, The New and Living Way. I want to go back over to the book of Hebrews chapter 4 where we left off. We've been in the book of Hebrews again this week talking about living in God's rest, getting rid of the unbelief and getting into a place of living by faith and living out of that place of rest, the rest of God that God intended for all of His children, all the believers to live in. But we have to learn some lessons. In other words, we have to renew our minds and renovate our belief system in order to line up with this idea or this concept of God's rest. So let's go back to verse number 1 and pick up from there. It says, "Therefore, since a promise remains of entering His rest, God's rest, let us fear lest any of you seem to come short of it." And again, coming short of something means that we are insufficient in and of ourselves to do this. We're trusting in ourselves and our ability to save ourselves, provide for ourselves, preserve ourselves, protect ourselves, go on down the list, heal ourselves and everything else, or some kind of man-made, institution or initiated type thing. Notice we're going to come short of the kind of life that God has for us. We're going to not measure up and live in the kind of rest that God wants us to live in. Now, again, that doesn't mean that entering His rest does not mean that we sit on the couch, become a couch potato, and do nothing, become inactive. That's not what He's talking about. But we have ceased from our own works and labor and efforts, our own self-reliant efforts and works, in order to try to measure up, in order to save ourselves, produce our own righteousness, earn God's favor and acceptance in our life. We've entered into His rest. Now we're working out of a place of rest. And I said that right. We are acting and behaving and living our life out of a place of rest. In other words, our motivation for good works is not to try to get up enough merit points with God in order to get His blessing and earn salvation in our life, right standing with Him in our life. Now our motivation completely changes when we enter into the rest of God. We're working and doing good works in a response to God's good work that He has done for us and in us. And that's a whole different ballgame. We're now from a place of rest. We are operating from a place that everybody else is trying to work and get to by their own self-efforts. We're not trying to earn and get victory in our life, work for victory in our life. We're actually operating and living out of a place of victory in our life. And I tell you, that just makes all the difference in the world. We're not trying to get God to meet our needs. No, our needs are already supplied according to His riches and glory by Christ Jesus. Now, because of God's finished work, because of the righteousness that He's given, because of His grace flowing continuously in our life, we can now come to a place of receiving. Not trying to get God to give. God's already given us all things that pertain to life and godliness. 2 Peter 1 says, now we're just receiving the provision that God has already given to us. See, that was what was supposed to happen with the children of Israel. They were supposed to go in and possess the promised land that God had already put in their hands and provided for them. But instead, they got caught up with unbelief. They got caught up comparing themselves with all the obstacles, the challenges, and they came to the conclusion that they could not enter in. They were coming up short of all those giants and walled cities, and they were not going to be able to enter in and possess their promised land. Well, why were they comparing themselves with all those obstacles and challenges? Because God said, I'll go before you. I'll fight your battles for you. I'll do all this, because they forgot God. They did not work God in to His equation at all. They were self-works minded rather than God's works minded. They were self-centered rather than God-centered. They were self-focused rather than God-focused. And that self-focused stuff, that self-business is always going to lead to a place of unbelief. You're going to be comparing yourself with the problem, with the situation, and you're going to find yourself wanting and insufficient and inferior in meeting those needs and overcoming those issues in your life. But when you put God in it, He's the Most High. When you begin to remember His works, remember the fact that He He delivered you from sin and from Satan, from darkness and from eternal hell and all those other things that go with it, from the curse and all those things. He delivered us. He's the one that did this. Jesus himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 24 tells us. So we have to become Jesus focused, God's works minded rather than our works minded. And again, that goes against the grain of the world's way of thinking. The world just does not consider God at all. God is kind of over in a small corner in their life and in their thinking and in their belief system. He's just kind of conveniently over there in the corner, and you know, they only kind of pull him out when they have to explain something unexplainable. That's not what God intended. God intended to be at the center of your focus and everything of your life. Not just on Sunday morning for an hour, maybe midweek during an hour. I'm telling you, God didn't send Jesus, his son, down here, and Jesus didn't go through all that he did so that God could have visitation rights with us, with his kids. He intended to move in and live with us, and we need to be God conscious and God aware in every part of our life. In other words, when we run up against a problem, a situation, a need in our life, then it's not going to bring hopelessness and despair and fear into our life, because we put God at the center here. And now we're not comparing ourselves with that problem, that challenge, that need, that issue. We're comparing those things with God, and they are not bigger than God. None of them are bigger than God. There's nothing out there that is bigger than the Most High God, that is going to stump God, that is going to exhaust his supply and leave you in need. I'm telling you. I know that's good preaching, all right? So, but anyway, it's good for all of us, right? So look at verse number 2. It says, "For indeed the gospel was preached to us, as well as to them," talking about that example, the children of Israel, "but the word which they heard did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in those who heard it." You know why they didn't really mix faith with the gospel message they heard? Because they weren't God-minded at all. They weren't God-focused at all. They were still believing in and of themselves that somehow they could meet their own needs. And I tell you, if they didn't meet their own needs, they couldn't get into that promised land. You know what they said? You know what their option was? Let's choose another leader besides God's appointed man, Moses, and let's return back to Egypt again. They forgot all of the bondage and the harsh and cruel punishment that was being inflicted on them by the Egyptians. But you know what they remembered? They remembered, you know, over there we had leeks and melons and garlic, and we had all these other stuff to eat. In other words, they were kept in bondage because they became Egyptian-minded and Egyptian-focused and dependent. In other words, they trusted in them. They trusted in men. They trusted in the Egyptian empire and the Egyptian government to meet their needs and supply their daily needs, even though they were oppressing them. You know, some people, it just amazes me that they will trade in their liberty and freedom for a proposed or a deception of some kind of security in their life from a man-made institution or a man-made or man-developed thing in their life. They'll trade in their liberty and freedom. They'll give that up, and they'll just make do with the bondage, the oppression, the harshness, just so they can have that false sense of security in their life. I tell you what, that is not freedom at all. Even though they were out of the bondage of Egypt, they were still in bondage by not trusting God, by not looking to God. They were still in bondage to the Egyptians, even though the Egyptians had been defeated before their face, and they were way away from them at this point. God had delivered them out of the natural bondage of Egypt. They were still in bondage on the inside because they still trusted in the Egyptians to meet their needs. And see, they never really got over to becoming God-focused and becoming God-reliant. And that's why they heard the gospel. They heard this good news. There's too good to be true. They heard that the promised land was there. God had given them the land, and He would go in and fight their battles for them. But they just didn't believe it. They just did not believe it. Why? Because they were too trained in self-reliant thinking. So verse number 3, it says, "For we who have believed do enter that rest, As he has said, so I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. I want you to see this. Although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. Verse 4, for he has spoken in a certain place of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. So what is he doing? He is actually comparing this right here and bringing the original creation and God's seventh day rest, his Sabbath day rest that he proposed on the seventh day, right into salvation for our redemption. Now I want you to see right here that, and this is the same trap that Adam fell in the Garden of Eden. Even though he was created at the end of the sixth day, and actually what he was supposed to do is enter in and live out of God's finished work, his rest. And when I say finished work, I mean a perfect work, a complete work. There was nothing lacking in Adam's life. But he bit the bait of Satan the deceiver. And he partook of the forbidden fruit, believing that God's works were unfinished and insufficient, and that he, by his own efforts, was going to have to do something in order to make up the difference from God's insufficiency, his incompleteness and imperfect work, and he was going to have to perfect himself through this. People are still doing this, folks. They're doing this in the area of salvation, I can tell you, because the same thing is true of salvation. The works are finished. The work of salvation and redemption is finished. Sin has been abolished. We've looked at all these scriptures that he laid out here in Hebrews. What an awesome book this is. He laid out all these scriptures about the finished work of Jesus, how Jesus, in his once and once for all perfect sacrifice, abolished sin in our life. But the problem is we still have an unfinished work mentality. We still have a mindset that we have to do something in order to perfect ourselves. That God's work was still imperfect, unfinished, and undone, and we're going to have to do something in the flesh in order to make up the difference. People are still biting that, and they're getting involved in the dead works of religion for that reason and that motivation. And see, that's what he's bringing out right here. He's bringing a parallel right in here. That just as Adam and Eve and the rest of mankind was supposed to enter in and live out of that perfect finished work of God that he had done over that 6 days, the children of Israel also were supposed to go into the promised land because it was already done. I mean, all they had to do was basically walk in and do what God said to do, which was basically nothing. We found that out. They didn't have to do all the effort and fight their own battle and by their own strength and energy overcome all those things. No, God gave all those giants and wall cities into their hand. When they went around the walls of Jericho, remember what happened? How did they defeat the city of Jericho? They marched around the walls of Jericho during those 7 days. That's what they did. And on the seventh day, they sounded the trumpets, and what happened? The walls of Jericho came down. And I'm not talking about they just tipped over. They sunk down in the ground like they went down in an elevator. Who did that? Well, God just put his thumb down there and just pressed it on down. It went down in the ground. We're talking about the Most High fighting your battles here. See, they could have done this 40-something years earlier, that previous generation. But they got caught up in their own self-focus, their self-reliance, and it just created a spiritual wall to their faith that they could not surpass and overcome. And I tell you, that's still going on today. And because that same thing with Adam and Eve, same thing with the children of Israel, we need to also accept the work of Jesus as a finished, perfect, sufficient work. We need to judge God's works as being sufficient. Our works are insufficient. God's works are all sufficient. They are complete. They're perfect. This work of salvation is a done deal. I can tell you, we can cease from our dead works of religion, trying to, by our own self-effort, self-reliance, self-focus, self-centeredness, trying to gain our own self-righteousness. Not going to work. We need to stop being deceived and thinking along that way. That's hindering our faith because we're not God-focused. Now, go on down to verse number 10. It says, for he who has entered his rest, the one who has entered the rest of God, has himself also ceased from his works, as God did from his. Now again, that doesn't mean we become inactive, but now the motivations have changed. Now we have corresponding actions of faith based on the finished work, based on the fact that our salvation is complete, that God's work in us and through us is complete. Now notice right here, when we enter His rest, we have also ceased from our works as God did from His. That's what entering His rest. How we get there? By believing the right thing, focusing on the right thing. Verse 11, let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. Notice you have to be diligent, just like what we're doing. This is why we're presenting these every day. You have to be diligent to renew your minds. You have to be diligent to uproot that old way of thinking, renovate that old way of believing, and adopt this new and living way, this new covenant lifestyle, way of thinking and way of believing. And I can tell you, it does take diligence. It takes some diligent effort on our part to do that. That's where the diligence comes in. Not through our outward works of the flesh, but by the inward works of hearing and hearing, believing, and then renewing our minds with what we're hearing. Well, that's all the time I've got for today. We're going to pick up here again tomorrow, as we always do. If you'd like additional resources and materials, go to tonycowan.org, and we will see you tomorrow.